In April 1945, as Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of Berlin just miles from Hitler's bunker, the Führer made one of the most baffling decisions of World War II. Instead of rushing every available division to defend his capital, he diverted his last reserves to Hungary. Not to save German lives, not to protect vital strategic positions, but to defend Hungarian oil fields that could no longer even supply his crumbling war machine. The single decision perfectly encapsulates how Hitler's own psychology became Nazi Germany's greatest weakness. Today, we are diving deep into the hidden story of how Hitler lost World War II. Not just the battles and dates you already know, but the psychological unraveling, the internal contradictions, and the human moments that revealed the fatal flaws at the heart of the Nazi regime. This isn't the story of inevitable German defeat. It's the story of how a man's growing paranoia and delusion turned Germany's early advantages into catastrophic weaknesses. Picture this. It's June 21st, 1941, the night before Operation Barbarossa. In East Prussia, Wehrmacht Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg sits in his tent, writing in his diary. The man who would later plant a bomb under Hitler's table wrote these haunting words: "Tomorrow we march into Russia. The Führer speaks of destiny, but I see only the endless horizon of the steppes and wonder if we march to glory or to our graves." Stauffenberg couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove. Within 4 years, he would indeed plant that bomb, convinced that only Hitler's death could save Germany from complete destruction. But the roots of that desperation stretched back to this very night, when Germany opened a second front it could never hope to sustain. To understand Hitler's downfall, we need to go back to 1940, when Nazi Germany stood at the pinnacle of its power. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk. To the world, Hitler looked like a military genius who had revolutionized warfare itself. But behind the propaganda facade, cracks were already showing. Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, recorded in his diary an increasingly disturbing pattern. Hitler's conferences were becoming monologues. Military advisors who dared question his strategic vision found themselves dismissed or worse. Heinz Guderian, the brilliant architect of Blitzkrieg tactics, later recalled, "The Führer lived in a world of his own. Maps became his reality, but he had forgotten what mud felt like under a soldier's boots." The German war economy was already straining by 1941. Despite controlling most of Western Europe, Germany faced a critical shortage of oil. The Nazi war machine consumed 7.2 million tons of oil annually, but produced only 4.8 million tons domestically. The temporary alliance with Stalin provided some relief, with Soviet trains dutifully delivering oil and grain right up until the morning of the invasion. But Hitler's racial ideology made this partnership impossible to sustain. On June 22nd, 3.8 million Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory along an unknown 800-mile front. It was the largest military operation in human history. The initial results seemed to vindicate Hitler's gamble. In the first months, German forces captured over 3 million Soviet prisoners and advanced hundreds of miles. But as autumn turned to winter, the limits of German logistics became brutally apparent. Lieutenant Hans Meyer-Welker of the 251st Infantry Division wrote to his wife from outside Moscow in November, "The cold is beyond description. Our weapons freeze, our vehicles won't start, and still the Russians keep fighting. We were told they would collapse like a house of cards. But every village, every street corner has become a fortress. I begin to understand what Napoleon faced. The weather wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. The German army had prepared for a swift summer campaign, not a prolonged winter war. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Engine oil froze solid, weapons jammed. Frostbite claimed more German casualties than Soviet bullets in some units. By December 1941, German offensive operations ground to a halt just 20 miles from Moscow's city center. But the real turning point wasn't the weather. It was Hitler's growing interference in military operations. General Guderian, commanding the 2nd Panzer Army, received increasingly bizarre orders from the Führer's headquarters. On December 8, 1941, Guderian recorded receiving this message: "The Führer commands all forces to hold their positions regardless of tactical disadvantage. Retreat is forbidden." When Guderian protested that his tanks were running out of fuel and spare parts, Hitler's response was telling: "Then they must fight where they stand until the last man." This wasn't military strategy. It was the psychology of a man who couldn't accept reality. Hitler had begun to believe his own propaganda. In his mind, willpower could overcome material disadvantages. He'd forgotten the fundamental truth that wars are won by logistics, not just courage. The human cost was staggering. Soviet resistance proved far more formidable than Hitler had predicted. Stalin, despite his own brutal purges of military leadership, had mobilized entire populations. Soviet factories were relocated beyond the Urals, beyond German bomber range. By 1942, the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The German advantage in training and tactics couldn't overcome the sheer weight of Soviet industrial capacity. At Stalingrad, Hitler's psychological weaknesses turned a tactical defeat into a strategic catastrophe. When General Friedrich Paulus requested permission to break out of the encirclement in November 1942, Hitler's response revealed his detachment from ground reality. Hermann Göring had promised the Luftwaffe could supply the 6th Army by air. Paulus needed 500 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe delivered an average of 84 tons. But Hitler refused to authorize retreat, convinced that admitting failure would shatter German morale. Captain Winrich Baer, one of the last officers evacuated from Stalingrad, later recalled, "The men were eating horses, then rats, then leather. They still fought because they believed the Führer had a plan." When the surrender came, over 200,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Most never returned. In that moment, many realized we were led not by a strategic genius, but by a man who valued his prestige more than our lives. The defeat at Stalingrad marked the beginning of Germany's long retreat. But Hitler's response wasn't strategic adaptation, it was increasing tyranny. He dismissed competent generals who brought him bad news and promoted yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear. The German war effort became hostage to the psychology of one increasingly unstable man. By 1943, internal resistance was growing even within Hitler's inner circle. Colonel von Stauffenberg, now recovered from wounds he'd suffered in North Africa, began organizing what would become the July 20th plot. In his letters home, he revealed the thinking that drove military officers to treason. "We swore an oath to Germany, not to one man's madness. Every day this war continues, more German cities burn, more German boys die. The Führer speaks of victory, but I see only catastrophe approaching." The irony was devastating. Hitler's refusal to consider negotiated peace meant that Germany would fight on until total destruction. Compare this to Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany in 1918, which sued for peace when defeat became inevitable. Wilhelm's Germany survived as a nation. Hitler's obsession with never surrendering guaranteed Germany would be occupied and divided. One of the most revealing moments came during the final assault on Berlin. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding Army Group Vistula, requested permission to evacuate civilians from Berlin's path. Hitler's response, recorded by his secretary Traudl Junge, was chilling. "If the German people are not strong enough to win this war, they deserve to perish. The strong will survive as nature intends." This wasn't military leadership, it was social Darwinist philosophy applied to an entire nation. Hitler had come to see the German people not as citizens to protect, but as subjects who had failed to measure up to his vision. Meanwhile, the most capable German commanders were reaching their own conclusions. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had once been Hitler's favorite general, confided to his aide in March 1944, "The Führer has lost touch with reality. He sees the war as he wishes it to be, not as it is. Unless someone acts soon, Germany will be rubble." Rommel would later be implicated in the July 20th plot and forced to suicide, but his assessment was shared across the German military hierarchy. By 1944, German generals were fighting a defensive war while their supreme commander lived in fantasies of wonder weapons and miracle reversals. The wonder weapons program itself revealed Hitler's disconnection from practical warfare.